Tehran's self-destruction, the great power game, and the price of the world's silence. In the early hours of a March morning in 2026, a farmer named Mahmood Rahman stood in front of a fertilizer shop on the outskirts of Dhaka, Bangladesh. In his hands was the money he had gathered to tend his 2 small rice paddies, but the shop owner shook his head. There's nothing anywhere. The price of urea fertilizer had surged nearly 70% from the previous month, and even at that price, there was none to be found. A narrow strip of water that carries 1/3 of the world's fertilizer trade had been sealed shut. At that same moment, an executive at a refinery near the port of Busan, South Korea, pressed his hand to his forehead as he took a phone call. More than 70% of Middle Eastern crude oil imports had been disrupted, and the volumes that were getting through were trading at well over $130 per barrel. Just 3 months earlier, the same oil had been $70. It had almost doubled. And somewhere deep inside the Persian Gulf, in a place whose name no one knew, a Filipino sailor stared out through the narrow porthole of his cabin. The ship hadn't moved in 2 months. The remittances to his family had long since stopped flowing, and whether his children would be able to keep attending school was no longer certain. These 3 people have no connection to one another. They have never met and likely never will. But something binds them together, a narrow passage of water, 48 kilometers at its widest, 160 kilometers long, the Strait of Hormuz. This book is about that strait, but it is not simply a story about geography and oil. It is about how one nation destroyed itself while destroying the world alongside it. It is about how a revolution becomes a monster, how nuclear weapons hold a state hostage to its own fear, and why the most powerless people always suffer first and suffer deepest. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched simultaneous strikes against Iran. The operation was called Operation Epic Fury. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, died that night in a bunker somewhere beneath Tehran. Within 24 hours, Iran sealed the Strait of Hormuz. From that day until this moment, 87 days, 20% of the world's oil and LNG supply has been standing still. The world is losing $20 billion every day. The cumulative losses have already surpassed $1 trillion. And yet, the people who started this war are safe. Trump is in the White House. Netanyahu is in his official residence in Tel Aviv. And the new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, is communicating with the outside world from some underground bunker through a network of couriers whose identities no one knows. A note of cynicism is in order here. Throughout history, those who start wars have rarely been the ones to pay for them. Roman emperors watched gladiators die in the Colosseum while soldiers bled on distant frontiers. 20th century dictators feasted while their people starved. The world of 2026 is no different. This book was written to document that structural injustice and to ask a question. Does pride and revenge save a nation? Or does it ultimately drag everyone down together? Did Iran destroy itself? Or was it cornered into self-destruction? And what can the world learn from this tragedy? Today is May 26th, 2026. Negotiations are ongoing. Shells are still flying. This story is not yet over. Chapter 1. How a Revolution Became a Monster. On a night in January 1979, the streets of Tehran were filled with millions of people. Allahu Akbar! God is great! The cry split the night sky. The last Shah of the Pahlavi dynasty, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, had already packed his bags and fled to Egypt. And a quiet old man who had spent years studying theology in a modest house near Paris Ruhollah Khomeini, boarded a plane home to the thunderous cheers of millions. The revolution was beautiful. At least in that first moment, it was. To understand why it happened, we have to go further back. In 1953, the CIA orchestrated Operation Ajax, toppling Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. His crime was attempting to nationalize Iran's oil industry from the British Anglo-Persian Oil Company. The United States and Britain crushed Iranian democracy to protect their oil interests. This was the first thorn driven into the relationship between Iran and America. The Iranian people did not forget. And as the Pahlavi dynasty, backed by American support, maintained its dictatorship for 26 years, that thorn drove deeper and deeper. The 1979 revolution, then, was not simply the fall of a monarchy. It was the explosion of 26 years of accumulated humiliation, a furious rejection of American interference. Khomeini read that fury with remarkable intelligence. He called America the Great Satan. This simple, visceral phrase compressed a complex historical grievance into two devastating words. In the immediate aftermath of the revolution, there was a brief moment of genuine possibility. Secularists, nationalists, communists, and Islamists had all joined in the uprising. But power was not shared. Khomeini enshrined the concept of velayat-e-faqih, governance by Islamic jurists, in the new constitution. Democracy was constrained in the name of Islam, and opposition forces were eliminated one by one. A note of cynicism here. Every revolution tends to come to resemble the thing it sought to destroy. The Shah's secret police, Savak, was replaced after the revolution by an even more powerful organization, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. The Shah had been accused of being America's puppet, but his successors became ideological puppets of their own making. The IRGC is one of the most important actors in this story. Without understanding it, the events of today make no sense. It was created in 1979 to protect the revolution, originally charged with monitoring the regular military and suppressing counter-revolutionary forces. But over the decades, it grew into a vast economic empire. Today, the IRGC is estimated to control more than 40% of Iran's economy. It owns or oversees dozens of companies in construction, banking, oil, and shipping. Physical control of the Strait of Hormuz belongs to the IRGC Navy. They frequently act independently of the Iranian government, so that even when diplomats at the negotiating table say, "We will make concessions," an IRGC missile launch in the field can render those concessions meaningless in an instant. In 2026, this is precisely the reality America faces. While Iran's negotiating team in Qatar works through the wording of an agreement, IRGC naval forces are laying mines near American destroyers and sending drones over the strait. Iran is not a country with two wills. It is a country with many wills, and no single voice controls them all. The revolution's most enduring legacy is the structural trap. The regime survives only by keeping America as its enemy. This sounds cynical, but it is analytically accurate. The legitimacy of Iran's theocracy derives from the anti-American revolution of 1979. If Iran were to fully reconcile with America and build a friendly relationship, it would become very difficult to answer the question, why did we need the revolution in the first place? The revolution's entire justification would dissolve. This is structurally identical to why North Korea cannot fully reconcile with South Korea. Without an enemy, the regime's reason for existing wavers. The enemy must be maintained, and if necessary, manufactured. Chapter 2. The Temptation of Nuclear Weapons. In 2003, Libya's dictator Muammar Gaddafi stunned the world. He announced he would voluntarily dismantle his secret programs for nuclear and chemical weapons. The international community cheered. The United States lifted sanctions. Europe welcomed Gaddafi back. Libya was readmitted to the world stage. 8 years later, in 2011, Gaddafi was dragged from a drainage pipe and brutally killed by rebel forces. NATO had provided military support to the very rebels who toppled him. The same Western world that had lifted his sanctions and shaken his hand sent bombers to end his rule. Iran's leadership remembers this vividly. And there is an even more direct lesson. Saddam Hussein. Saddam had no nuclear weapons. International inspectors combed Iraq after the 1991 Gulf War and found nothing. In 2003, the United States invaded on the basis of intelligence claims about weapons of mass destruction, and Saddam was hanged. That intelligence was later shown to be fabricated or wrong. But by then, it was far too late. These two cases left a very clear equation in Iran's strategic calculus. Nations that keep weapons of mass destruction survive. Nations that give them up fall. And the most perfect proof of this equation was provided by North Korea. North Korea is poor. It is isolated. Its people go hungry. And yet North Korea has nuclear bombs. And the Kim dynasty endures. America called North Korea part of the axis of evil, but it never actually attacked a nuclear-armed North Korea. Iran's leadership cannot possibly be unaware of this. This is the deepest reason Iran cannot give up its nuclear program. It is not regional ambition. It is survival insurance. Iran has never officially admitted to developing nuclear weapons, of course. It has consistently claimed its program is for civilian nuclear energy. But IAEA inspections have told a different story. At the underground facilities of Fordo and Natanz, inspectors found uranium enriched to nearly 90%. Nuclear power plants require 3 to 5% enrichment. 90% is weapons grade. In 2015, the Obama administration brokered the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, with the P5+1. The United States, Britain, France, Russia, China, and Germany alongside Iran. Iran agreed to dramatically scale back its nuclear program and allow international inspections in exchange for the gradual lifting of decades of crippling sanctions. But then came 2018. President Trump unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA. He called it the worst deal in history. Sanctions were reimposed. Iran's economy began suffocating again. The Iranian rial collapsed. Inflation exploded. Iran's hardliners said, "We told you so." America cannot be trusted. If we give up our nuclear leverage, they will try to destroy us. More Iranians listened. As of 2026, Iran is estimated to hold approximately 450 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, enough for multiple nuclear weapons. America's demand is simple. No dust, no dollars. No uranium disposal, no asset release. Iran's position is equally simple. Negotiations first, uranium afterward. A note of cynicism here. The logic of nuclear-armed states demanding that other states give up nuclear weapons is structurally contradictory. The United States holds approximately 5,500 nuclear warheads. Russia holds roughly 6,000. These are enough to destroy the Earth many times over. When they tell Iran not to have nuclear weapons, the double standard Iran perceives is not entirely without basis. The real tragedy of the nuclear question is this. Demanding that Iran give up its weapons without first creating a world safe enough that Iran doesn't need them is like telling someone to walk unarmed into danger. It is not a solution. It is a demand. Chapter 3. Hormuz, the strait that took the world hostage. Pull out a map. Find the Persian Gulf wedged between the Arabian Peninsula and Iran. At its far end, the narrowest point where the Gulf meets the Arabian Sea, lies the Strait of Hormuz. At its most constricted, it is just 48 kilometers wide, slightly shorter than the distance from Seoul to Suwon. Through this sliver of water flows 20% of the world's oil supply and 25% of its LNG. Approximately 20 million barrels of crude oil pass through every single day. The oil and gas exports of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, and Qatar, the bulk of them, travel this route to the rest of the world. Around 30% of the world's fertilizer also moves through here. South Korea imports more than 70% of its Middle Eastern crude through this strait. Japan sources nearly 90% of its imported oil this way. India and China are similarly dependent. In short, this is the most critical artery supplying blood to the hearts of Asian economies. And the northern bank of the strait, the longer coastline, belongs to Iran. Through Hormuz Island, Keshem Island, Larak Island, and others, Iran sits in a position where it can physically control this passage. On February 28, 2026, within 24 hours of Operation Epic Fury, the IRGC Navy sent a radio warning to every vessel attempting to transit the strait. No ships are permitted to pass through Hormuz. This was not a bluff. By the following dawn, IRGC drones and speedboats had made physical contact with multiple tankers. Marine insurance companies immediately suspended coverage for the region. Without insurance, ships do not move. This is the iron law of modern shipping. Operators of $100 million tankers cannot risk transiting a war zone uninsured. Overnight, the number of ships passing through Hormuz fell from the normal 135 per day to 6, a 95% collapse. Then came the oil price response. On the day of the strikes, Brent crude was at $70 per barrel. A week later, it crossed $100. On March 19th, Dubai crude hit a record high of $166 per barrel. South Korean gasoline prices crossed $2,500, $1 per litre. In the United States, the price exceeded $4.50 per gallon. But the oil price spike was only the tip of the iceberg. The real damage spread far beyond energy, rippling through the entire global supply chain. Consider the fertilizer crisis. Qatar is one of the world's largest exporters of urea fertilizer. Saudi Arabia too. These countries' fertilizer exports were blocked. Global agricultural markets began to unravel. Urea prices surged over 70%. Supplies of ammonia and phosphate fertilizer collapsed. When farmers cannot get fertilizer, or cannot afford it, they reduce planting or abandon it altogether. The result shows up 6 to 12 months later as falling harvests. The Food and Agriculture Organization issued an urgent warning. The window for action is only weeks. If fertilizer supplies aren't restored now, serious food crises will emerge in developing nations in the second half of 2026 and into 2027. War risk insurance premiums exploded from less than 1% of cargo value to 3 to 10%. Container freight rates soared. Going around Africa's Cape of Good Hope instead of through Hormuz adds 2 to 3 weeks to a voyage, adds tens of thousands of dollars per day in operating costs. This is enormous. One of the world's largest container shipping lines, Hapag-Lloyd, reported weekly losses of $60 million from the Hormuz situation. Approximately 2,000 ships are trapped inside the Persian Gulf. Crews are aboard these vessels. Sailors stranded for 2-3 months, cut off from their families, wages delayed, psychologically broken, are another category of victims this war has created. Their names never appear in the news. Iran's transit fee policy complicated matters further. Iran declared it would permit vessels from countries it deemed friendly, or ships that paid fees of up to $2 million per vessel to pass. Chinese ships paid in yuan and transited. Russian-affiliated vessels did the same. But for Western allied shipping companies, accepting Iran's terms risked violating sanctions, so they were trapped between impossible alternatives. To be blunt, Iran's transit fee policy is a clear violation of international law. Hormuz is an international strait under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Coastal states, including Iran, have no right to impede innocent passage. The British Royal Navy publicly declared the blockade had no legal force. But in reality, IRGC drones and mines proved more powerful than legal texts. A note of cynicism here. The UN Security Council is structured so that if any one of 5 permanent members exercises a veto, it can do nothing. Even as the world burns, a single powerful nation's refusal to sign can prevent the fire trucks from rolling. This structure was built in 1945, from the seeds of the Cold War. 80 years later, it hasn't changed. Its beneficiaries are always the strong. Its victims are always the small. Chapter 4. America's Dilemma. I am not in a hurry. In May 2026, President Trump said this, and on the very same day, the US Navy struck Iranian missile batteries in self-defense near Hormuz. America was saying it wasn't in a hurry while fighting battles every day. This contradiction is the perfect symbol of Trump's and America's dilemma. What does Trump actually want from this war? The stated objectives are straightforward. Eliminate Iran's nuclear program, normalize Hormuz, secure Israel's security. But Trump's real objectives are political. Keep the House Republican in November's midterm elections and secure a legacy. These two goals pull against each other. For the midterms, the war needs to end quickly. Gasoline in America costs $4.56 per gallon, a 4-year high. Trump's approval rating on inflation is 36%, a record low. Kentucky farmers say they can't afford fertilizer. If this situation continues until November, analysts say Republicans risk losing the House. That would block every major agenda item for Trump's remaining term. For legacy, he needs a complete victory. A half-measure agreement, one where Iran keeps some uranium, a 10-year temporary fix, isn't enough for Trump. He wants a total denuclearization deal he can hold up and say, I did what Obama couldn't. Between these two goals, Trump keeps swinging. There are fractures within the Republican Party too. Senator Lindsey Graham calls any deal with Iran too weak and pushes for stronger military action. On the other side, libertarian-leaning members oppose the war and demand immediate withdrawal. Democrats are increasingly vocal against the war itself, arguing that starting it without congressional authorization was unconstitutional. Yet paradoxically, if a deal comes together too quickly, they'll attack it as too favorable to Iran. Strategically, America is operating on 3 levers. Military pressure, carrier strike groups deployed near the Persian Gulf, ongoing self-defense strikes, a naval blockade of Iranian ports. Economic pressure, the blockade costs Iran roughly $500 million per day in lost export revenue. Diplomatic encirclement. Trump has linked any Iran deal to Saudi Arabia and Turkey joining the Abraham Accords. But each lever has weaknesses. Military pressure complicates negotiations. When the Navy strikes Iranian facilities, Iran's hardliners pile more pressure on the negotiating team not to compromise. Economic pressure may have already hit its ceiling. Iran's economy was already gasping at 50% inflation before this war started. The Abraham Accords linkage is backfiring. Pakistan immediately rejected it, and Saudi Arabia and Turkey have said nothing publicly. The domestic politics of Muslim countries make normalization with Israel impossible for their leaders, even if they privately wanted it. A note of cynicism here. American foreign policy has a recurring habit of solving one problem while creating three others. Supporting the Taliban to drive out Soviets in Afghanistan led to 9/11. Removing Saddam Hussein expanded Iranian influence into Iraq. Now, trying to eliminate Iran's nuclear program has blocked Hormuz and shaken the global economy. The scale of American power means the scale of American mistakes is also enormous. Chapter 5. Why Israel Could Not Wait. On May 26, 2026, today, Israel announced an expansion of its strikes against Hezbollah in Lebanon. 50 fighter jets dropped 160 bombs. On the very day that the United States and Iran were saying a deal is possible within days, Israel widened the front. This was not coincidence. To understand Israel's behavior, you must understand one man, Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu is Israel's longest-serving prime minister. He is known as a master of political survival. And right now, he faces two simultaneous crises: the external crisis of an Iranian nuclear threat and the internal crisis of potentially losing the election scheduled for October 27th. Israel's fear of Iranian nuclear weapons is existential, and it should not be dismissed as political rhetoric. Israel is a nation of 9 million people. Iran's former president Ahmadinejad said Israel should be wiped off the map. Iran's proxy Hezbollah has tens of thousands of rockets aimed at Israel from Lebanon. Hamas has carried out devastating terrorist attacks from Gaza. In this context, if Iran were to acquire nuclear weapons, Israel would lose all ability to deter it. The deterrence balance would shatter completely. For Israeli leaders, this means our country could cease to exist. And that is not a metaphor. It is their lived reality. Israeli intelligence, Mossad, had been warning for years that Iran's nuclear program was approaching a critical threshold. The expansion of centrifuges at the underground Fordo facility, growing stockpiles of highly enriched uranium, restricted IAEA inspector access. All of it read as signals that Iran was rapidly approaching nuclear weapons capability. Now or never. That was the conclusion of Israel's military strategists. But honesty requires separating the security calculation from the political one. Netanyahu faced polling showing his coalition bloc trailing the opposition bloc, 50 seats to 60 in Israel's 120-seat Knesset. Israeli media noted the timing of the Iran strikes relative to the election. Wars don't change leaders. The psychology of wartime rally around the flag effects is real. In wartime, populations tend to consolidate around the incumbent. Netanyahu understood this. A note of cynicism here. Decisions made for national security and decisions made for personal political survival have an uncanny tendency to coincide. Whether that is coincidence or calculation, only the decision maker can know. And sometimes even they blur the line in their own minds. What does Israel actually want from the US-Iran negotiations? Looking at early draft agreements that were disclosed, two things critical to Israel were absent: limits on Iran's ballistic missile program and the severing of Iran's regional proxy network, including Hezbollah. Even if America makes a deal with Iran, if Iran keeps its missiles and keeps funding Hezbollah, the deal is meaningless to us. That is Israel's position. So whenever a deal appears imminent, Israel strikes Lebanon. This is a deliberate strategy of disruption, because Iran has made a ceasefire in Lebanon a precondition for negotiations. Israeli strikes on Lebanon make it harder for Iran to return to the table. That forces Trump to push harder, increasing the likelihood that the ballistic missile and proxy clauses Israel wants will end up in any final agreement. Chapter 6. Khamenei's Choice, the God in the Bunker. On May 26, 2026, today, Mojtaba Khamenei is in an underground bunker somewhere in the world. He is reported to have suffered serious injuries to his face and legs. He has not appeared in public even once in nearly 3 months. Even Iran's senior officials do not know exactly where he is. Communication with him happens only through a network of secret couriers. One American official, briefed on the situation, described it as almost like a sitcom. Watching the Iranians try to communicate with their supreme leader in this way, clearly in a state of bewilderment. But this is no sitcom. It means that one of the most consequential negotiations in modern history is being decided by messages passed through a secret courier network. Who is Mojtaba Khamenei? He is the son of the former supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, who died in the US-Israeli strikes of February 28, 2026. Mojtaba was reportedly injured in the same attack. He is a man who experienced, in his own body, what it means to die the way his father died. That experience casts a shadow over every decision he makes. Russia's ambassador remarked that Khamenei was in Iran but not appearing publicly for understandable reasons. Those reasons are obvious. He does not want to die like his father. This situation creates a structural problem for negotiations. Iran's negotiating team in Qatar receives an American proposal. They need Khamenei's approval. But Khamenei is in a secret location. Messages travel through couriers, and the process takes days. America grows frustrated. Why is this taking so long? Iran responds, "We require our internal approval process." This physical communication bottleneck is one reason why Rubio's "a deal is possible within days" keeps getting pushed back by more days. What is Khamenei's real dilemma? It is whether to cut a deal with the enemy who killed his father. The conditions America is demanding, uranium removal, long-term enrichment moratoria, unconditional Hormuz opening, are extraordinarily difficult to accept from the standpoint of Iran's theocratic dignity. The uranium removal requirement especially. Hand over your most powerful bargaining chip first. Looks like capitulation to Iran's hardliners. On one hand, Khamenei knows Iran needs a deal to prevent economic collapse. The rial has cratered. Inflation is at 69%. Citizens are struggling to afford basic necessities. Iran's internet was blocked, and President Pezeshkian's order to restore it was itself a signal that maintaining information blackouts in this economic environment would generate more resistance than it prevented. On the other hand, Khamenei faces enormous pressure from internal hardliners. IRGC senior commanders, first-generation revolutionaries, hardliner parliamentarians. They argue that any deal is a betrayal of the revolution. Overriding their pressure could destabilize the regime itself. There is also the theological dimension. Since Khomeini's revolution, Iran's theocratic system has defined America as the Great Satan. Reaching an agreement with the Great Satan means negating the worldview the regime has taught its people for decades. The moment Khamenei signs an agreement, that worldview fractures. So he is looking for a way to compromise that doesn't look like compromise. Hormuz can reopen, but under Iranian management. Uranium can be addressed, but framed as a voluntary decision. This is why negotiations are currently stuck in a battle over words. The substance has largely been agreed upon, but how each clause is phrased matters enormously for domestic Iranian consumption. A note of cynicism here. Throughout history, leaders of authoritarian regimes have feared internal revolt more than external threat. Before Gaddafi was toppled by NATO-backed forces, he was weakened by domestic rebellion. Iran's leadership likely fears the collapse of the economy and the popular anger it generates more than American bombs. That fear of domestic consequences is what drives them toward the negotiating table. Today, Khamenei issued a written statement for the Hajj season, declaring, "The hands of the clock cannot be turned back. and American military bases will no longer serve as shields in this region. He also said the cry of death to America would spread across the world. This came on the same day negotiations were ongoing in Qatar. The supreme leader issues hardline rhetoric, while the negotiating team works on concession language. This is not contradiction. It is a calculated dual performance, placating hardliners while quietly pursuing a deal. Chapter 7. Why the World Grew Angrier. The Information War. On Saturday, May 23, 2026, President Trump posted on Truth Social, "An agreement with Iran has been largely negotiated and will be announced shortly." World oil markets reacted immediately. Brent crude dropped several percent. Stock markets rose. Investors, believing the strait would soon reopen, bought assets. 2 days later, Iran's foreign ministry contradicted this. There is no imminent agreement. Secretary Rubio said, "A few more days will be needed." Oil prices rose again. Stock markets wobbled. This wasn't a one-time occurrence. It happened in March, in April, in May. Negotiations are going smoothly. Leads to markets stabilize, leads to no agreement yet. Leads to markets roil. This cycle has been repeating for 3 months. Is this simply the result of diplomatic uncertainty? Or is it the product of deliberate information warfare? Every war is fought simultaneously on 2 fronts: the physical front of guns and bombs, and the information front of narratives and perceptions. In the Iran war of 2026, the information front is just as fierce as the physical one. Trump's Truth Social post, Rubio's optimistic statements, the Iranian semi-official news agency's contradictions, all of these are information management in service of each side's interests. From America's perspective, maintaining the perception that negotiations are going well has the effect of stabilizing oil prices and easing domestic inflation pressure. When markets believe this will be resolved soon, the speculative premium on oil contracts shrinks. From Iran's perspective, emphasizing that no agreement is imminent signals to domestic hardliners we are not rushing, while simultaneously keeping America tied to the negotiating table. The financial market dimension is particularly striking. Every time a negotiation breakthrough headline appears, markets move upward, and each time the situation reverses, markets fall. This pattern benefits someone. If there are actors who know information before it becomes public, or who know a report is false and take positions in the opposite direction, this volatility represents enormous profit opportunity. This is the most opaque intersection of war and finance. Large financial institutions have channels to government, internal analysts, satellite image analysis. They can understand developments faster and more accurately than public information allows. Individual investors are left making decisions based only on what appears in media. The investor who reads "deal agreed" and buys crude-related assets, then reads "not yet" 2 days later and takes a loss, while actors who anticipated the reversal positioned the other way and profited. This is how geopolitical war and financial markets meet at their most shadowy point. A note of cynicism here. In democratic societies, information is supposed to flow freely, but in reality, the speed, accuracy, and access to information are profoundly unequal. The most important and accurate information always reaches the most powerful first. This is the structural inequality of capitalist information markets, and it is most extreme during geopolitical crises. The world's frustration built through a different channel as well. 22 nations issued a joint statement calling on Iran to reopen Hormuz. The UN Secretary-General urged immediate de-escalation. The British Foreign Secretary warned that the world is sleepwalking toward a food crisis. None of it moved Iran, because Iran had China and Russia as backstops. When the international community's condemnations produce no results, people exhaust themselves. 3 months of negotiations, and nothing improved. That exhaustion began converting into, just end it, militarily. The very nations that had wanted to prevent war began wanting someone to finish it. Chapter 8. The Anatomy of Self-Destruction. When emotion consumes strategy. Wars do not begin with gunfire. They begin when miscalculation piles on miscalculation, when fear feeds on fear, and when one final, decisive mistake crosses a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. Tracing the origins of the 2026 Iran war, you find not a single cause, but decades of accumulated miscalculation and emotion. To understand this, consider a simple thought experiment. 2 people meet on a narrow path. One believes the other means to harm him. The other feels the same. In reality, neither intends violence, but both clench their fists in self-defense. The other reads it as aggression and strikes first. A fight erupts. This is called the security dilemma. For 45 years, the relationship between America and Iran deepened this dilemma. The more Iran developed nuclear capabilities, the more threatened America and Israel felt. And the more they pressured Iran, the more Iran felt it needed nuclear weapons. Tighter sanctions strengthened Iran's hardliners. Stronger hardliners drove tighter American pressure. This vicious cycle tightened for 45 years before exploding in 2026. This is the real meaning embedded in the title, Iran's Self-Destruction. Iran did not choose to destroy itself. Iran pushed the only survival strategy it believed in to its limit. And that strategy itself produced catastrophe. Reread Mojtaba Khamenei's Hajj statement. The hands of the clock cannot be turned back. This is not mere rhetoric. It is the declaration of a man who cannot stand at the same table as those who killed his father. It is the politicization of revenge. And the moment revenge becomes political, rational strategic calculation yields to emotion. The IRGC's behavior makes this politicization even more visible. While negotiators work on language in Qatar, IRGC forces fire missiles at American destroyers in the field. Diplomacy and combat proceed simultaneously. The IRGC is not the foreign ministry. They are the guardians of the revolution, and reaching a compromise with the revolution's enemies negates their very reason for existing. So the further negotiations advance, the more aggressively the IRGC acts to reassert their relevance. This is the most dangerous mechanism for negotiation collapse. The political leadership wants a deal. The military organization wants war. And when a single shot is fired at the wrong moment in the field, every diplomatic effort collapses in an instant. History is full of such examples. In 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo by a single nationalist, combined with Europe's complex alliance system and leaders' catastrophic miscalculations, ignited a 4-year war that killed 16 million people. In the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, Soviet submarine B-59, misreading American training depth charges as actual attacks, almost launched a nuclear torpedo. Only the coincidental presence of Second Captain Vasily Arkhipov, who refused to authorize the launch, prevented nuclear war. It was not a statesman who stopped the apocalypse. It was one sailor's judgment. In 2026, similar moments are playing out every day in the Strait of Hormuz. IRGC boats approach US destroyers. American pilots strike Iranian military facilities. Iranian drones are shot down. Each incident is justified as self-defense, but their accumulation risks producing an uncontrollable escalation at any moment. A note of cynicism here. The leaders who decide on war are often portrayed in history books as clear-eyed strategic geniuses. But a close examination of actual wars reveals that many of them began not through cool calculation, but through fear, vanity, miscalculation, and uncontrollable chains of events. Human rationality is far more fragile under crisis conditions than we like to believe. Chapter 9. Those Left Behind. This morning, Mahmood Rahman stood again in front of the fertilizer shop in Dhaka. The prices were still nearly 70% higher. He decided to plant only half his fields. His harvest this autumn will be half what it normally would be, which means his family will face a harder winter. He doesn't know exactly where Hormuz is. He doesn't know how the Iran nuclear negotiations are progressing. He doesn't know what Trump and Khamenei are saying to each other. He only knows that fertilizer is too expensive, and he is afraid his family will go hungry. These are the real victims of this war. According to the World Food Programme, 10,000 tons of food prepared for children in Afghanistan has still not arrived. The ship carrying it is stranded inside the Persian Gulf. These children are not Taliban. They are not IRGC. They are simply hungry. The Food and Agriculture Organization warns that if fertilizer supplies are not restored right now, serious food price crises will emerge globally in 6 to 12 months. The most immediate impact will fall on sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Central Asia, on the 3.4 billion people who already spend more money servicing debt than on education. Returning to the sailors. Approximately 2,000 ships are trapped inside the Persian Gulf, with tens of thousands of crew members aboard. Many are Filipino, Indian, Indonesian, and Burmese workers, low-wage foreign sailors who work at dangerous routes to support their families. The International Transport Workers Federation is reporting severe deterioration in crew mental health. Confined to cramped cabins for over 90 days, uncertain when they'll be able to leave, cut off from their families. The psychological stress is extreme. Some vessels are reportedly running short of food and fresh water. The economic ripple effects reach unexpected places. Egypt has seen its tourism revenue plummet. Cruise itineraries through the Middle East have been cancelled, and air routes over the Red Sea have been reduced. Egypt's economy depends heavily on Suez Canal tolls, tourism, and remittances. All three have been hit simultaneously. Dubai, ironically, sits in a peculiar position. The UAE was targeted by Iranian missiles, yet Dubai has historically maintained close trade relations with Iran. The Jebel Ali port's cargo volumes have dropped sharply. Synthesizing all of this, the damage from this war does not concentrate in specific places the way damage from traditional wars does. It spreads in every direction through the networked connections of the global economy, and its shockwaves hit unconnected countries harder than they hit the belligerents. The most tragic dimension: the vast majority of those suffering had no role whatsoever in causing this war, no influence over how it progresses, and no say in how it will be resolved. They only receive the damage. Chapter 10. Is there a path to resolution? Must we simply watch powerlessly as our families are destroyed, as innocent people suffer in silence? To answer this question honestly, we must first see reality clearly. In the short term, the ability of individual families or small businesses to change this situation is extremely limited. Hormuz is blocked, oil is expensive, and fertilizer is scarce. These are structural problems that no individual effort can resolve. But there is nothing we can do is a lie. At the individual level, there are things that can be done. Reducing energy consumption, maintaining appropriate food stocks, finding alternative suppliers, and most importantly, understanding the structure of what is happening. Without understanding, panic takes over. With understanding, you can at least distinguish between what is temporary and what is structural. At the corporate level, Energy supply diversification, revised inventory strategies, and supply chain reconfiguration are all in motion. South Korean refineries are already expanding sourcing from Norway, Texas, and Alberta, increasing short-term costs, but building long-term security. At the national government level, countries like India, Japan, and South Korea can explore bilateral agreements with Iran for transit rights. Some are already testing this path, though it risks conflicting with the US-led sanctions architecture. At the international level, Britain's proposed Hormuz multinational mission, escorting commercial vessels through the strait with naval protection, represents a path that affected nations can pursue independently of US-Iran negotiations. But the strongest and most sustainable solutions require structural change. First, energy diversification. Asia's overwhelming dependence on Middle Eastern oil has been exposed as its most dangerous vulnerability. Accelerating investment in renewable energy, nuclear power, and diversified oil sourcing is essential. This cannot be completed in a few years, but not starting now means the next crisis will bring identical suffering. Second, food security. Diversifying fertilizer supply chains, expanding domestic fertilizer production capacity, strengthening strategic food reserves. South Korea's food self-sufficiency rate of approximately 45% is among the lowest in the developed world. This crisis has demonstrated again that food self-sufficiency is a national security issue, not merely an agricultural policy question. Third, UN Security Council reform. The structure in which 5 permanent members' vetoes hold the world hostage has persisted for 80 years. Without changing this structure, strong nations will continue to paralyze global responses to crises whenever it suits their interests. A note of cynicism here. These structural reform proposals are raised every time a crisis arrives, and when the crisis passes, most of them fade. UN reform has been debated for decades with nothing changing. Energy diversification gets talked about whenever oil crosses $100. Then interest fades when prices drop. This is humanity's collective amnesia instinct. Yet history also shows change is possible. It simply requires sufficient pain to persist long enough. Chapter 11. The Anatomy of Information War. Truth in a Fog of Smoke. On Saturday evening, May 23, 2026, CBS News, MSN, and several other major outlets simultaneously reported Iran reaches agreement in principle on disposal of highly enriched uranium. The headline spread across social media in minutes. Crude oil futures markets reacted instantly. Asian equity futures rose. But look closely at that report, and something strange emerges. The phrase, agreement in principle. Agreeing in principle is not actually agreeing. It means, perhaps we could agree. Yet those who only saw the headline understood a deal has been made. This is the most sophisticated form of information warfare, creating misunderstanding without technically lying. We live in an era of too much information moving too fast. News pours out 24 hours without pause, and social media distributes billions of messages per second. In this environment, people tend to form judgments from headlines alone. The context, conditions, and uncertainties behind those headlines vanish, leaving only simplified messages. States and power centers know this, so they manage headlines. In this war, information warfare operates on multiple simultaneous levels. The first is managing perceptions of the negotiation status. When Trump says 95% complete, no one outside the room can verify that number. When Iranian officials say no imminent agreement, it is impossible to distinguish between an accurate description and a tactical statement. No one outside the negotiating table knows the true state of affairs. The second is managing military situation perceptions. America describes its strikes as self-defense. Iran describes the same events as ceasefire violations. Both descriptions can be partially accurate. Complete truth exists nowhere. The third is managing economic damage perceptions. America emphasizes that Iran is losing $500 million per day from the blockade. Iran claims alternative export routes are recovering some of the losses. Ordinary people have no way to assess which numbers are accurate. In this information environment, what should individuals do? First, never depend on a single source. Reading only Trump's Truth Social, or only Iranian state TV, or only CNN. Each gives you only a partial picture. Cross-referencing multiple sources is essential. Second, distinguish between agreement in principle and actual agreement. Political language is chosen with enormous care. Mostly negotiated means negotiations are not finished. Progressing favorably may mean nothing has been decided yet. Third, examine information alongside incentives. Who is releasing this information and why? When Trump says a deal is almost done, oil prices drop. Lower oil prices improve his approval ratings. He has a political incentive to create the impression of imminent resolution. In international financial markets, this information war structurally disadvantages ordinary investors. Large financial institutions have government channels, internal analysts, and satellite imagery analysis. They can understand developments faster and more accurately than public information allows. Individual investors are left making decisions based only on media reports. The person who reads deal agreed and buys oil-related assets, then reads not yet 2 days later and takes a loss, while actors positioned in the opposite direction, knowing the reversal in advance, profit enormously. This is the most opaque junction where geopolitical war meets financial markets. Chapter 12. The Map of Blame. Where does responsibility lie? Who bears the greatest responsibility for this war? This is not a simple question. Anyone who claims there is a simple answer has not understood this complex history sufficiently. Responsibility operates across multiple layers. The first layer, Iran's IRGC and hardliners. Blockading Hormuz and charging transit fees is a clear violation of international law. Holding civilian ships and sailors hostage approaches the level of crimes against humanity. Blocking fertilizer supplies in ways that may cause more than 20 million people to face food insecurity amounts to an assault on all of humanity. The direct responsibility for these actions lies with Iran's hardliners. The second layer, the United States and Israel. The strikes of February 28, 2026, were the direct proximate cause of everything that followed. America and Israel had legitimate security concerns about Iran's nuclear program. But the manner of those strikes, particularly the assassination of Khamenei, was executed in full knowledge that Iran's extreme response was predictable. We didn't anticipate this is a difficult claim to make. The third layer, China and Russia. China actively assisted Iran in evading sanctions. It paid transit fees in yuan, kept buying Iranian oil, and helped Iran avoid international isolation. Russia vetoed UN Security Council resolutions blocking coordinated international responses. Without their support, Iran would have come to the negotiating table far sooner. The fourth layer, the international system itself. The UN Security Council structure designed in 1945 does not fit today's world. The international reality that only nuclear-armed states are safe made nuclear acquisition Iran's rational choice. Structures of economic inequality and energy dependence maintained systems that continuously made smaller nations victims. The fifth layer, all of us, citizens who elected these leaders, societies that did not reduce energy consumption, governments that were slow to transition to renewable energy. These collectively built the Middle East oil dependence that created this crisis's vulnerabilities. Distributing responsibility this way might invite the objection. So no one is truly at fault. No. The weight of responsibility differs by layer. Direct responsibility for actions that caused civilian harm, blockading Hormuz, attacking civilian vessels, belongs most heavily to Iran's IRGC. This is difficult to justify legally or morally. But the responsibility for creating the conditions that produced this behavior, the chain of sanctions, treaty withdrawals, and military strikes that drove Iran into a corner, cannot be ignored when assessing America's and Israel's roles. And the critique of China and Russia, who operated from behind this entire situation for profit, and of an international system that failed to change, is equally legitimate. History does not run on simple good versus evil frameworks. Complex causes interweave in complex ways to produce complex results. And most of those results are borne by people who created none of those causes. Chapter 13. The Record of 87 Days. A Timeline of Self-Destruction. Iran's self-destruction did not happen overnight. It was gradual, often predictable at each stage, and at every junction an alternative path was possible. But at each decision point, the situation moved toward escalation. This timeline traces that structure. February 6th to 27th, 2026. The last chance for negotiation. From February 6th to 27th, 2026, talks in Geneva represented the final diplomatic opportunity before war. 2 broad agreements were reportedly reached, but on core conditions, particularly how the uranium would be handled and what verification mechanisms would look like, agreement proved impossible. During this period, Israel had already set its own timeline for independent action. Israeli intelligence had picked up signals that expansion of Iran's underground Fordow facility was imminent. The conclusion reached was now or never. February 28, 2026. Operation Epic Fury. At 2 a.m., Israeli Air Force F-35s and American B-2 stealth bombers simultaneously entered Iranian airspace. Targets included nuclear facilities, missile bases, command and control infrastructure, and the Supreme Leader's location. Ali Khamenei died in a missile strike on his bunker beneath Tehran. His son Mojtaba was also injured. Within 24 hours, the IRGC Navy declared the Hormuz blockade. This was not improvised. It was the execution of a pre-planned retaliation protocol. March 1st to 8th, the first wave of escalation. Iran began missile and drone attacks on US military bases in the Gulf region and on Israel. Energy infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, and Bahrain was struck. Brent crude crossed $100 per barrel. The international response was deeply disappointing. 22 nations issued condemnations, but China and Russia did not participate. March 8th to 19th, the emergence of transit fees. Iran moved beyond simple blockade to active management of the strait. Friendly vessels could pass, others faced fees of up to $2 million per ship. Dubai crude hit $166 on March 19th, an all-time record. March 30th to April 7th, third round of negotiations. A month into the war, both sides felt the pressure to return to negotiations. A 2-week ceasefire with limited Hormuz transit was agreed, but no progress was made on nuclear issues or permanent resolution. April 8th to 12th. The ceasefire and its immediate fractures. Within hours of the ceasefire taking effect, Israel resumed strikes in Lebanon. Iran called it a violation. The US argued Lebanon was a separate front. The IRGC continued controlling transit fees. Direct talks in Islamabad collapsed on April 12th. April 13th. US naval blockade of Iran. Trump declared a full naval blockade of Iranian ports. Iran began losing approximately $500 million per day in export revenue. April to May. The cycle of negotiation and combat. The pattern continued through May. Negotiations in Doha, Muscat, and Islamabad proceeding simultaneously with military engagements. Trump repeatedly said, "Almost there." Iran repeatedly said, "Not yet." May 23rd to 26th. Largely negotiated, and its rebuttal. Trump announced on May 23rd that a deal has been largely negotiated. Iran immediately contradicted this. Today, May 26th, the US Navy struck Iranian missile facilities again, while negotiating teams continued talks in Doha. What does this timeline reveal? At every junction, a different choice was available. If talks had advanced slightly more on February 27th, the strikes might not have happened. If Iran had chosen more limited retaliation after the strikes, rather than total Hormuz blockade, the economic crisis might have been far less severe. If Israel had not struck Lebanon during the April talks, an agreement might have been possible. Yet at each stage, the situation moved toward escalation, because each actor prioritized short-term interests, political survival, and domestic opinion over long-term costs. The long-term costs, the global economic hemorrhage, the suffering of innocent civilians, were not adequately factored into the calculation. This is the structure of self-destruction. It is not one decision. It is the accumulation of dozens of small decisions, each accompanied by the assessment, "This much is acceptable," until at some point, the point of no return is crossed. Chapter 14. The negotiations now, the hardest 5%. On May 26, 2026, Secretary Rubio said, "Negotiations have now narrowed to the difference of a single word, a single phrase. 95% is done." This sounds hopeful. But why is the remaining 5% so impossibly hard? In negotiations, the last 5% is always the hardest, because the early stages of any negotiation consist of finding common ground. Neither of us wants war. We both want economic stability. We both prefer peaceful resolution. These principle-level agreements come easily, but when the specific clauses are reached, hidden conflicts emerge. And the clauses that remain unresolved at the end are exactly the ones that were hardest to give up from the beginning. They haven't been agreed yet, because they couldn't be agreed from the start. The 5 core unresolved issues. First, the fate of the enriched uranium. The US demands that 450 kilograms of highly enriched uranium be transferred to America or destroyed on site. Iran says this can be discussed after negotiations are complete. The American slogan, "No dust, no dollars," links this to frozen asset release. Why is this so sensitive? For Iran, the enriched uranium is not merely a material. It is negotiating leverage. Our ability to build a nuclear weapon is the reason America keeps negotiating with Iran. Being told to surrender that leverage first is, from Iran's perspective, being asked to throw away their cards before the hand is dealt. Second, Hormuz management. America demands Iran unconditionally reopen Hormuz without fees. Iran insists on maintaining coastal state management rights. This sounds like a semantic difference, but is substantively enormous. If Iran retains management rights, it can still block specific ships it dislikes. The fees may disappear, but the chokehold doesn't. Third, the timing and sequence of sanctions relief. Iran wants asset release first, then nuclear concessions. America wants nuclear measures first, then verified relief. This is the chicken and egg problem. But it is actually a trust problem. America doesn't trust Iran. Iran doesn't trust America. Neither will give first. Fourth, the duration of the agreement. America initially wanted a 20-year moratorium. Iran offered 5 years. 12 years is currently being discussed. But even this number is more complex than it appears. If Iran has the right to resume enrichment after 12 years, it is a 12-year temporary solution, not a fundamental resolution. Fifth, Lebanon and Hezbollah. Iran demands a ceasefire on the Lebanon front as a precondition for agreement, but this is Israel's sovereign decision. Can America force Israel to stop striking Lebanon? Israel asserts freedom of action. America's leverage over Israel on this is limited. These 5 unresolved issues are interconnected. Resolving uranium might unlock others, but if uranium can't be resolved, everything stops. This is the structural difficulty of the negotiations. A note of cynicism here. If today's negotiators truly made ending the world's suffering their absolute priority, this negotiation could be resolved far faster, because both sides actually want this agreement. The obstacle is not technical, it is political. How does each side explain the outcome to its domestic audience? How often do world leaders prioritize international humanitarian concerns over domestic political calculations? History's answer is sobering. Epilogue. On the word self-destruction and the truth that no one won. Let me return to this book's title. Iran's self-destruction. Did Iran truly destroy itself, or was it driven to self-destruction? This is not merely a rhetorical question. It is the central question that determines who bears responsibility for this crisis and what direction the future should take. The epilogue begins with a question. Who were the real winners? The answer? There are none. Did America win? There is still no agreement. Oil prices are elevated. Approval ratings are at lows heading into the midterms. Iran's nuclear program has not been fully dismantled. Iran's uranium remains in Iran. The complete denuclearization Trump wanted has not been achieved. Did Israel win? Some Iranian nuclear facilities were struck, but Iran's uranium stockpile exists. The IRGC remains intact. The Hezbollah threat has not disappeared. And within Israel, the question, what was all this for, is being raised loudly as the October election approaches. Did Iran win? Its economy is on the verge of collapse. Its supreme leader is injured and hiding in a bunker. Inflation is 69%. Over 90% of exports are blocked. Citizens struggle to buy basic goods. Is this winning? Did China win? Short term, yes, buying Iranian oil cheaply and advancing yuan internationalization. But global economic recession damages Chinese exports too. China ultimately needs a stable Hormuz as well. Did Russia win? High oil prices help Russia short term. But global economic instability harms Russia's economy too. And Russia displayed no leadership in this crisis. So, who truly profited? Here is the most honest answer. If anyone benefited, it was those who profit from chaos. Hedge funds operating large crude oil futures positions, companies with alternative energy technologies, defense industries selling more weapons as conflicts persist, and forces that, while the world's attention was fixed on the Middle East, quietly advanced their own interests elsewhere. This is the most ruthless truth of geopolitical conflict. Wars exhaust the nations that fight them, and there are always third parties who profit from that exhaustion. Returning to self-destruction. Iran clearly has elements of self-destruction. The Hormuz blockade was catastrophically harmful to Iran's own economy. Over 90% of Iran's exports transit Hormuz. Blocking a strait you need to keep open is swinging an axe at your own foot. Revenge and emotion overriding strategic reason. Yet self-destruction alone is insufficient to describe this situation. There were conditions that drove Iran to self-destruct. The 1953 coup, 26 years of backed dictatorship, the nuclear deal withdrawal, the supreme leader's assassination. All of these drove Iran into a corner, and cornered creatures choose self-destruction. This is the most important message this book carries. Self-destruction is not the product of madness. It is the last choice of an entity that believes it has no other options. And other nations, other people, other organizations, sufficiently cornered, will make the same choice. This is a warning for all of us. To prevent war, we must not create situations that corner others. We must leave room for negotiation. We must find ways to resolve conflicts that don't require the complete destruction of the other side's dignity. This sounds like idealism, but history's most durable pieces were all built this way. Peace achieved by completely crushing the other side doesn't last. It plants seeds of new revenge. After the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles completely humiliated Germany. That humiliation gave rise to Nazism and the Second World War 20 years later. After the Second World War, the Marshall Plan helped rebuild defeated Germany and Japan. The result was over 70 years of peace. This historical lesson applies to today's Middle East. Completely destroying Iran, humiliating Iran into abject submission, this may look like short-term victory. But the resentment and humiliation planted in that process will manifest as the next generation's conflict. Real victory is not Iran giving up nuclear weapons. Real victory is not America crushing Iran. Real victory is creating a world so safe that Iran doesn't need nuclear weapons, a world with no incentive to blockade Hormuz. That is hard, and it takes a very long time. But it is the only sustainable solution. Finally, let us return to the people we met in the prologue. Mahmood Rahman in Bangladesh. His fields are only half planted. The South Korean refinery executive is still pressing his forehead as he takes calls. The Filipino sailor trapped in the Persian Gulf is still staring out through his cabin porthole at the sea. When this war ends, their damage will not be immediately repaired. Time will pass before fertilizer prices fall, oil normalizes, stranded ships are freed, and supply chains recover. During that time, they will keep suffering. Is this suffering just? The answer is one word: no. And that no is precisely why this story must be remembered. Those who start wars do not see this suffering, but we must see it, and we must remember it. That is the only force that can prevent the next self-destruction. Pride and revenge do not save nations. They drag everything down together. This is the most bitter lesson that 87 days have delivered to the world. Conclusion. The conditions for right solutions. What this crisis must leave behind. No war in history was ever started with an accurate cost estimate. European leaders in 1914 said the war would be over by Christmas. It lasted 4 years and 2 months. The Iraq War's projected cost of $50 billion ultimately exceeded $2 trillion. The same pattern repeats in 2026. The current NPT structure was created in 1968. 58 years later, it is outdated in multiple ways. Its basic design: nuclear states keep their weapons while others are absolutely forbidden to acquire them, is structurally inequitable. And the nuclear-armed states outside the NPT framework, Israel, India, Pakistan, face no sanctions, while Iran inside the NPT faces them for attempting nuclear development. This inequity creates rational incentives for nations like Iran to pursue nuclear weapons. Genuine resolution requires nuclear-armed states to accept real reduction obligations as well. The UN Security Council's paralysis in this crisis, unable to act on something so clearly requiring collective response, was deeply disappointing. International law clearly prohibits what Iran has done with Hormuz. But the body that can declare it illegal is paralyzed by veto mechanics, and there is no enforcement mechanism. Changing this requires Security Council reform. Iran was fully integrated into the world economy. That economic integration did not prevent war. In fact, using Iran's economic dependence as sanctions leverage was part of what drove Iran into a corner. Economic interdependence is a necessary condition for peace, but not a sufficient one. Political trust, diplomatic channels, and legal dispute resolution mechanisms must accompany it. None of the current generation's leaders will emerge as true winners. Trump won't get the perfect deal he wanted. Netanyahu won't achieve complete Iranian denuclearization. Khamenei won't be able to avoid compromise. The only possible true winners are the next generation. If this crisis accelerates the renewable energy transition, stimulates nuclear non-proliferation reform debates, and drives changes in the UN Security Council, future generations can live in a less vulnerable world. For that possibility to become reality, this crisis must not be forgotten. We are all witnesses to this story, and witnesses have a responsibility to remember what we saw and to raise our voices so it doesn't happen again. Thank you.